My name's Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor and a trauma therapist. And I'm doing this video to focus on the 4 ways that we might be sabotaging our emotional stability or somehow out of awareness replicating our early experience and why we might be doing this. You might not be all using each of the 4 methods that I'm going to discuss, but it's likely that you might be using one or perhaps more if you do struggle with your mental health or if you're experiencing, you know, strong emotions in general. So when I say sabotaging your recovery, I'm not saying that this is something that you are consciously choosing to do. It's more about maintaining an environment, an emotional environment, which is familiar to us. So if you think about someone who's been brought up in a very stressful environment, it's likely that they're going to have developed ways to cope with that environment. So eventually that way of coping more than likely will become a personality style. It becomes who we are and how we react to the world, which means that in adulthood, there's a good chance that we're still going to be reacting to the world as it was then, even if things have changed for the better. So if you think about it logically then, when we try to reduce the levels of distress and emotions in our process, what we were actually doing then is trying to change the historical way of coping that our brain is used to. We're trying to alter an environment that we're very used to surviving in. And our brain isn't going to want to do that because these old ways worked. And even though the old ways might not be necessary now that we're adults, the brain will not just want to accept that those old threats are no longer a danger. It's going to still perceive that they're in the environment and it's going to need to do what it used to do to survive. So it goes against logic then that we would resist being in a better frame of mind, that we would actually sabotage that process. But we're talking about methods of physical or emotional survival here, and a brain that is used to thinking that way. Why else would people who've been ignored or devalued by parents throughout their childhood be drawn towards relationships with people who will treat them exactly the same? Our brain wants to stick with the familiar, with the patterns of behavior or the feelings that it's used to, because it perceives that that is the best option for physical or emotional survival. It knows that environment. But clearly, if we keep putting ourselves back in the same dangerous, neglectful, or stressful situations that we grew up in, it's it's not an optimal safety choice in the present. So gaining an understanding of how we do this is vital, especially when it comes to us being able to make changes for the better. So there are of course a lot of medical conditions that have physical or psychological, or emotional responses. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to go anywhere near them. But even in those cases too, understanding the ways that our psychological process might be maintaining our poor emotional health might be useful to know, as awareness in this area often gives us the power to make some differences, just to think a little bit differently about something. So hopefully, after I explain the 4 ways that we might be, you know, maintaining a historical emotional environment which we don't need, you might be able to get a better understanding of the concept and begin to challenge some of the ways that might be getting in the way of your emotional growth. Okay, so the first way that we might create negative feelings for ourselves would be via a thing called projection. And this simply means that we create feelings within ourselves by fantasizing that something is happening in the environment. And we believe that this fantasized belief is a fact, and we respond to it either emotionally, physically, or both, as if it is true. So for example, we might be projecting that someone thinks we're ugly or stupid, that someone is going to attack us, someone is going to abandon us, that someone thinks we're a bad person, that they're thinking our house is untidy, that they hate us, or that they are angry at us because they haven't responded to our text message. The list just goes on and on. But when it comes to what we might be thinking, is going on in the minds of others or the environment. Now, I'm not saying here that we should ignore our perception, as perception keeps us safe. So we still need to be checking out any projections that are telling us that we might be in danger. But as adults, if you think about it from the adult perspective, should we be so scared of people shaming or guilting us? The answer is no, logically. I think, extreme emotion should only be felt around situations in which our life is threatened, or if we're dealing with a truly terrible situation of loss. So what we need to be aware of is what is a healthy perception of a situation and what is being influenced by projections that are creating high levels of emotion within us, because our brain is just trying to maintain that equilibrium of feelings which we've always had. So for example, if we think about the person who projects that people are thinking that they're ugly, they might have had that said to them a lot when they were young by a shaming parent or a sibling or children at school. So this is a historical reality for them. It's something that actually happened. But in their hypervigilance now as adults, they might be still preempting a similar attack, which means that the projected belief of that attack keeps them locked in that early place of fear and shame. And it's unlikely they're going to start challenging that because it was based on fact. And the projection is going to say, oh, but you can't say it won't happen because it did happen. And projections are very, very powerful in keeping us locked in those ways. So another example of projection could be that people with abandonment issues will usually be projecting that people are going to abandon them. By projecting this belief, they're maintaining their childhood position of insecurity by constantly believing that everyone's going to abandon, judge, or neglect them, like they were abandoned, judged, and neglected as a child. So people who grew up in violent environments, they quite naturally develop the belief that the world is a dangerous place. So they're going to be projecting that situations or people are dangerous and they could be attacked or killed. That if that person's looking at me over there, that they might be going to attack. That will be just going on in their processes. That's what they're used to. So people who are very down or sad will more than likely be projecting the belief that there's no point doing anything positive. There's nothing good will come of it. They might be projecting that people are thinking there's too much for them, that people won't want to hear about their suffering. So, and that will probably be a little bit of how it was for them when they were little, that people didn't care, just people weren't interested. They didn't get that mirroring they needed. So they're projecting out that other people aren't going to want to meet that need now. So what you project is likely to be dependent on your early experience, and your response to the projection will be there to give you an option how to cope with that experience or to generate a feeling from that historical time, which will keep your brain in that sort of position of vigilance which it's used to. But like we're saying, it's likely that these reactions are now obsolete and troublesome for your mental health because those coping strategies were developed very early on in life when options that are available now were not available then. So if you couldn't talk to adults when you were a child, you may have had to suppress all your, a lot of your feelings. But now you can go and talk to adults. You can talk to people. But if your process is projecting that that's pointless, you might believe that projection. So the second way that we might be maintaining negative emotions is via procrastination. So this would be that we might be putting off things, leaving them till last minute, or avoiding things completely. So people who procrastinate often think that their procrastination helps them not to think about things that are stressful. But actually, if you think of it logically, it's an anxiety management tool. It actually creates or elongates periods of anxiety by keeping you in an anxious place longer. It could even invite consequences that are dangerous for you. So our brains aren't stupid. They know when we should have done something. There is, and especially when there's going to be a consequence. So out of sight isn't really out of mind because the mind is generating anxiety in the background, even though we might not be aware of it. It still knows we've got this thing to do, but somehow we may be able to detach from those feelings. Some people will have that ability, but like I said, not feeling it doesn't mean to say it's not there in the background. And to keep it in the background, people who procrastinate might be drawn to addictions to transiently detach from that anxiety. It gives them a sort of distraction. It helps to appease the anxiety by adding another chemical or a dopamine fix to the body, to the process. You could also suggest that some people who were brought up in a world where there was pretty much constant anxiety will unconsciously reenact that early experience by procrastinating. I mean, when you think of it, it's a great way just to stay with your stress, to keep yourself in a place of anxiety all of the time. So some people also procrastinate about college work or any situation in the workplace where they've had to present their skills or knowledge to others. There is likely a projection accompanying this situation that projects that if they do the work, that it isn't going to be good enough or that other people are going to think they're big-headed, which can sometimes be as scary for some people. So to avoid the projected shame of failure, judgment, or success, they convert that shame into fear and feel anxious about about not doing what they need to do. So in this case, the procrastination creates fear to avoid the projected shame or judgment that's coming from people. And maybe that's how life was for them growing up. A lot of fear around disappointing their parents or being told that they were showing off when they were just owning their cleverness, when they were just wanting to show a dance routine. They'd, designed to their parents and they were devalued for that. So it creates that fear of actually being you, of being good, being seen. So procrastinating and not doing something that you should be doing for someone who can be aggressive could of course trigger angry responses or even an attack. So children brought up in hostile, chaotic environments might reenact that by frustrating people in adulthood. And then you've got people who are very sad and down. They might procrastinate because they truly believe there's no point, that it's hopeless to try to change. And by taking this stance, they might keep themselves locked away with the misery. And this position will more than likely replicate the lack of emotional support they received in childhood. They didn't get it then, so what's the point of trying to get it now? Everything feels hopeless. Right, the third way we sabotage our well-being might be with behaviors. So if we're doing something that is unethical, immoral, or just not nice, there's going to be a kickback to that behavior within our process or from the environment. We might not always be aware of it, but it will be there somewhere generating negative energy that needs to be managed, if we are detached from the consequence. Our brain knows, our brain still knows we've done something wrong. So if we have poor boundaries and a lack of impulse control, we're less likely to be focusing on the consequences of our actions. Because the impulsive or the immoral behavior might be more enticing as there's often a pleasure payoff, a transient dopamine fix that enables us to enjoy the bad behaviors and not think about the consequences. So whether we are stealing something, telling lies, or having an affair, once that behavior has been done, we are left with the consequence. Some people might be able to detach completely from caring about that consequence, but that also comes with a price, because it means they have to detach from certain emotions, which limits their capacity to form healthy relationships, which might be somewhat similar to their early experience, while others, in response to their bad behavior, might go to terrible guilt, devastating shame, or terrifying fear. So they've got themselves back into how they used to feel as a child by behaving in some negative way in the present. But this isn't just about doing bad behavior. It's about doing anything that recreates our early situation. And usually we do have an idea that this is happening. We're just not very good at stopping doing it because the brain, it doesn't want to stop. So typically we create the feelings that were most dominant for us in our young environment. And depending on our personality style or our particular set of coping strategies, we will either recreate these feelings for ourselves or act in ways that make those around us feel how it was for us as a child. So people with abandonment issues, for example, will typically be behaving in ways that often results in them abandoning others or being abandoned themselves, which recreates the shamed experience that abandoned children feel as a result of believing that they were bad and not lovable enough to be wanted. So people who are depressed and very low might avoid going out and hide themselves away with their suffering. They may not eat properly, they may not clean themselves adequately. It's a bit like they've resigned themselves to stay in a collapsed position, which resembles their early experience where their emotional needs and many of their physical needs were just not getting met. So people brought up in an environment where they were regularly persecuted might act in ways that invite further persecuting from the police, doctors, teachers, anyone who's an authority figure when they're an adult, just to get that aggression directed at them, which was normal for them. And then you've got, people who discovered that the only way they could get attention was as a result of being victimized or playing the victim in infancy. They might grow up to take on this position in adulthood and act in ways that make people feel sorry for them and give them attention. They'll be very needy for that because their brain will feel, that's the only way they can get genuine attention is by being in that victim position. So the last of the four ways that we would create the feelings for ourselves would be with rumination. And this will be the one that people are most likely to be familiar with because we can pretty much recreate any emotion if we ruminate about it often enough. So the person who has had an affair, for example, by doing what they give themselves, by doing what they do, gives themselves an injection of shame that they can ruminate about whenever their process needs to convince themselves that they're a bad person and that they deserve to feel shame. And shame has a way of doing this. It often invites people to, if they can't generate enough shame by just thinking they're a bad person, they might go out and do something that proves to themselves that they are, which generates a whole new load of shame. The person with and of course, because they've done that, then they can ruminate about. The person with a fear of annihilation who was brought up in a violent household, they're going to likely ruminate about possible risks and dangers in the environment. The guilty person will be ruminating about something they perceive that they've done wrong or not good enough. The heartbroken person will be ruminating over the love that is lost or what could have been. And a person in grief, they might be fixated and ruminating on one aspect of their love, their loss over others. And this might be keeping them locked in shame or guilt because that's what their brain is most familiar with feeling. So typically, the feelings that we are creating by ruminating are those that are most dominant in our psychological process, unless we are racketing our emotions, which means we're replacing certain emotions for others. So depending on who we are will depend on which mix of these four ways we might be implementing and using them to sort of maintain this emotional equilibrium we used to. People with a lot of shame in their process might be using all four of these methods to create their shame, because shame often needs to be maintained quite ruthlessly, and it's a really tough emotion to shift from people who feel it chronically. And people who have a lot of guilt in their process would more than likely not procrastinate when it comes down to looking after others, but they might do so when they need to do something for themselves. So their houses might need 1,000 jobs doing, but the person they're looking after, everything will be done there. So in effect, it's useful if you can understand what your emotional management system is, so you can figure out how to rewire it. Well, hopefully this has been useful in helping you to consider how to start challenging some of the ways you may be managing your world. Because if we can take a breath and think about how truly relevant the projection, the behavior, the rumination, or the procrastination is in that moment when we are doing it, then we can give ourselves a moment to think if there's another option. So the rule of thumb would be the more you're thinking, the less you are reacting. And if we can get good at that, which of course takes time, then there's hope for change. So be thinking about analyzing the situation rather than reacting to it, whatever it is, whatever situation is creating an emotion for you that you don't like, you need to be analyzing it, and you need to be thinking, is there another option, or is this something from history being played out here that I'm creating this feeling? Well, thanks for watching. And if there's anything discussed here that you think would be interested to look at a little bit deeper, just pop a message in the comments below and I'll see if I can do a video to explain it a little bit further. And thanks for watching, and I'll pop another one of these up shortly. Goodbye.